Right, so this sort of helps explain how within churches, as well as within politics, more democratic understandings of things are taking place. But this still, like even Jefferson and his successor, James Madison and James Monroe, these guys didn't go out and actively campaign for office. Right? People campaigned on their behalf. They didn't walk the streets and shake a lot of hands and kiss a lot of babies. Right? They still like to think of themselves as above the fray. By the late 1820s and early 1830s, politicians, let me just rewind again. So like Jefferson didn't like to sort of perpetuate the idea that he himself was a common man. His supporters would, but he would never sort of say, oh yes, I am just like all of you. By the 1820s and 1830s, politicians were doing that, and most especially Andrew Jackson. And this is another sort of second really critical political moment for the perpetuation of democracy. And again, it came out of a need and a desire to get people out of power who Jackson did not believe should have been there. The election of 1824 pitted 4 candidates against one another, including another Adams, John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and 2 other candidates. As the election result, Henry Clay and William Crawford. As the votes came in, and by this time, in part as a result of Jeffersonian politics, electors were more commonly elected by the people as opposed to just through state legislatures. Right? When the votes came in, Andrew Jackson had not a majority of all the votes, but the most votes. John Quincy Adams was second. And yet, because neither man had a majority within the Electoral College, who got to decide who would be the next president? Any guesses? Now I lied earlier. There is a tougher question. If there's a contested election, what does the Constitution say? Who does the Constitution say gets to decide it? No, not the Supreme Court. That's what we think after the election of 2000, right? But it's not the Supreme Court. Exactly. The House of Representatives gets to meet and decide these things. And within the House of Representatives, where, though these are democratically elected representatives, decisions are often made as people are sort of, sitting in the back of a room, kind of elbowing one another and saying, I'll give you a favor if you vote for my guy. Within the House of Representatives, despite the fact that Andrew Jackson had received the most votes, the election was thrown to John Quincy Adams. And what do you think Andrew Jackson and his supporters did after that? They said, the voice of the people was suppressed in this election. More people voted for our guy than the guy who is now president. And yet he's not in office. And from 1824 to the next election in 1828, groups of politicians rallied and mobilized voters in a very direct way, appealing to democratic ideas, to ideas that all men are equal. Now, of course, that meant all white men. And by 1828, Jackson came into the White House. And in a famous event, which perhaps some of you have heard of, the White House became taken over by the common man. You've heard of this, right? It's an interesting story. Right now, like inaugurations, right now are these very austere, right, very sort of formal events. Everything is closely scripted. Andrew Jackson's inauguration in March of 1829 was anything but. Jackson himself was in mourning because his wife had just died. And as a result, after his election, he sort of kept himself to himself. He didn't go to a lot of public events. As a result, all of his supporters who had helped get him into office, common farmers and artisans, people who 20 years ago wouldn't necessarily have been able to vote, were waiting for the moment to celebrate their hero. And after Jackson gave a speech, which was largely inaudible because he kind of mumbled quite a bit, and took his oath of office, all of those who had helped get him into office, who were in Washington, D.C., escorted him back to the White House. As one observer said, countrymen, farmers, gentlemen, mounted, meaning on horses, and dismounted, boys, women, and children, black and white, which was surprising. I suspect the black were probably servants at this time because I doubt very many African Americans voted for Andrew Jackson. But all of these groups filled the streets. And then the White House. China and crystal crashed to the ground. Silk upholstery perished at the expense of muddy boots as people scrabbled to see the people's hero. This is a very symbolic moment in which the supposed man of the people had found his way to the highest office in the land. And unlike Jefferson, Jackson perpetuated this idea, right? He had been from the frontier regions of Tennessee. He had been a commoner of humble birth. He had fought several duels, even having a bullet lodged within his body. But in his campaigning in 1828, he very much embraced the idea of democracy. All right? So I hope that this has given you an indication of how we get from the idea of democracy not necessarily being a good thing to democracy being a very good thing. What do you think Jackson's opponents did after 1828 whenever they wanted to get Jackson out of the White House? Well, no, they didn't yet, right? Slavery wasn't abolished until the Civil War, and then only reluctantly by many. Now, you're right, though. An increasingly large number said, how is it this Jackson guy got elected? Because some said, this guy is a border ruffian who's fought all these duels, and can he really be trusted? Some people said, well, maybe he got elected in part because the institution of slavery and the fact that he was a slaveholder, and the 3/5 clause, right, which gave Southern states extra votes, as the argument goes, he was able to get into the office. So it does increase, and in recent research has suggested precisely what you're saying. It increases anti-slavery sentiment, which is a great point. But slavery itself is not abolished. So what do the opponents of Jackson do when he's in the White House and they look at his policies and they say, God, these policies are terrible? How do they begin to mobilize to try to get Jackson out of the White House? We've got to start appealing to more of the people. We have to start finding voters who are like us, or convince people who aren't voting, right, that they should think like we do, so that we can get this man elected out of office, right? Again, so now you have opponents, including John Quincy Adams and others, who hadn't been particularly fond of democracy, having to embrace it as a pragmatic strategy in order to come into power, right? And so the opposition group mobilizes itself and it begins to embrace some of the ideas that earlier it had been reluctant to do. Okay, so this kind of explains some of the larger events that have taken place here.